Wassalam ala Rasulillah. Welcome again to TISA Talks. This is basically a video webinar that we do about once a month, talking about things that are important both to the TISA community and to the world. And what you see in front of you is something we're promoting on TISA Talks just about every time, because we are very concerned about the kind of leadership that we're seeing in terms of what's going on in the world. It's called the Center for Ethical and Effective Organizational Leadership, and you'll be hearing more about this, our contribution to thinking about and moving ahead in terms of the issues that face us in the world. Today's TISA Talks is on leadership in times of crisis, and it's very appropriate. I took a quick look before this webinar started, and we're really at about 200,000 deaths in the United States of America. That's a crisis. Since May 20th, 2020, we literally have had demonstrations in the streets that have to do with the issue of justice and race in the United States. That's a crisis. And so I'm sure there are many other crises in the United States, the wildfires on the Western coast, the hurricanes that seem to never end in the Gulf. And so we felt it was appropriate to talk a little bit about leadership in times of crisis. We start with, the English rendering of it is, let there arise out of you a band of people, inviting to all that is good, enjoying what is right, and forbidding what is wrong, the other ones to attain felicity. I think this is a ayah of the Quran that's important for these times and for all times. And it's easy to react to the crisis and shrink back in fear. It's easy to react to the crisis and go and attack against somebody who you think started it. But to do what the Quran says, to enjoy what is right and forbid what is wrong, is much, much harder. So today, our two guests are two people who are very much involved in leadership positions, including in the Islamic Seminary of America. They're Dr. Iqbal Unus and Chaplain Tahara Akmal. As in the past, we are co-sponsored by the Muslim Endorsement Council, Rabata, the educational organization, the Association of Muslim Chaplains, and a continuous charity, which is an organization that actually provides non-interest loans to Muslims who are pursuing higher education. So our two guests are no strangers to crisis in the United States of America. And our first one is Dr. Iqbal Unus. There's much more to Dr. Unus than on this slide. When I looked at his Bible, the same for Chaplain Akmal, I said, well, I'm going to have to pick and choose here. I met Dr. Unus quite a while back in one of the positions that's not on the slides, when he was the Dean of the Graduate School of Islamic and Social Sciences, which is located in Virginia at that time. And I was a visiting faculty there. Dr. Unus has a PhD in nuclear physics from Emory University. He's worked at the International Institute of Islamic Thought, one of TISA's partners, IIIT, since 1990 in various positions, including the head of Fairfax Institute, another educational institution. He was Secretary General of the Islamic Society of North America, which we know as ISNA, where he served in the 1970s and 80s, and in several positions with ISNA/MSA, because MSA, as many of you know, morphed into ISNA, and they're separate now. He was one of the founders of the MSA, and therefore one of the founders of ISNA, and he's still on the board of directors, I believe, of ISNA right now. He's published several articles, a book chapter on governance, 2 children's books, an edited volume, and on American Muslim life. And he's going to talk a little bit about a book that has just come out, I believe, or about to come out, on leadership in relationship to our beloved Prophet Musa alayhi salam. He's the chair of the board of the Islamic Seminary of America, and he's a trustee of Amana Mutual Funds. Our other guest is, there's something wrong with the slide, of course, last minute, you saw the picture before, is Chaplain Tahara Akmal. She has a PhD candidate in leadership studies, right, at Alvernia University in Pennsylvania. She has a master's in interdisciplinary studies in pastoral care and counseling and studies from Claremont School of Theology. She has an ACPE certified, she's an ACPE certified educator for the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. I think it actually took, and Chaplain Tahara can talk about it, it took longer to get that the certified clinical pastoral education than the other degrees, because there's a lot of work that goes in. She's a chaplaincy resident. She worked at several other places, supervising and being supervised. So it's a big thing in terms of setting standards for chaplains in the clinical field. She's a certified clinical pastoral educator, one of the few Muslims certified clinical pastoral educators at MedStar in Washington, D.C. That's where she is presently, but she also was an educator at Reading Hospital School of Health Sciences in Pennsylvania and the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. She's on the faculty of Beyond Claremont, I think now Beyond Catholic Theological Seminary, Moravian Theological Seminary, and she's also on the board of directors of the Islamic Seminary in America. This does not do justice to either Chaplain Tahara or Dr. Unus, because there's much, much more they've done, and you'll hear from them about it. And these are things that I picked that to illustrate the kind of leadership that we're talking about, that on the one hand has the educational credentials, but on the other hand have helped to build institutions both within and outside of the Muslim communities, have taught both Muslims and non-Muslims about leadership and organizational development. And so we'll talk to them both in a moment. I just want to do a little advertising for the Islamic Seminary in America. This semester, we've already started. We just finished the first round of our 4 courses. There's Advanced Hadith Sciences and Hadith Commentary by Dr. Jonathan Brown and Dr. Yasser Khadi. There's Islam in America being taught by Attorney Louis Alouche from CARE, the chair of the board of CARE, and the Imam Hamza Abdul Malik, who's the Imam at the Memphis Midtown Mosque. And then there's myself. Fiqh Muamalat was taught this weekend by Rafai Arifin, who's both an Imam and a practicing lawyer, and Ubaidullah Evans, who is a graduate of Al-Azhar. And the course that just finished within the last hour, actually, a very dynamic course taught by Dr. Shark Siddiqui, who's also a lawyer, the principles of fundraising. These are the kinds of things we're doing. Next in the spring, we're going to be teaching advanced akhlaq, inshallah. We're going to be teaching evolution of fiqh, inshallah. We're going to be teaching the power of prejudice, inshallah. We're going to be teaching a special course on Islam and evolution. So if you're interested, you can go to our website and find out more about how to apply. So we always, Brother Tariq, our consultant for development, says always remind people that if you want to make the dream happen, always remind them that we need money for the organization to function. And stronger leaders for stronger communities, we try to rebuild for a better world. So for more TISA Talks, if you like what you see today, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You will find, I think this is the 10th one, you'll find the other 9, and you'll find a lot about both the issues that we care about and what's going on in TISA itself. But again, what TISA is about, our vision is to a better world that is enriched by religious education and ethical leadership. Those are the things we're about, giving good, solid religious education, Islamically speaking, and encouraging the kind of ethical leadership that will follow the Quranic mandate that says, let there arise out of you a band of people, inviting to all that is good, enjoying what is right, and forbidding what is wrong. They are the ones that obtain felicity. So the way we'll operate today, alhamdulillah, is we'll have Dr. Unus make a brief presentation with a PowerPoint, and then Chaplain Tahara make a brief presentation with the PowerPoint, and then I'll ask them questions, and then you will have the opportunity to text us or chat with us with questions that we'll try to take on at the end. Again, we're talking about leadership in a time of crisis, and they're going to talk about their experience, particularly in what they've seen in our organizations, as well as what Chaplain Tahara has seen as the front line. She's not only a clinical education, she's a first responder in that. And part of what clinical pastoral educators do is they act as chaplains in hospitals. And so she's in Washington, D.C., and we're looking forward to hearing from this. We'll now introduce Dr. Unus. Since I stop my screen share.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalam Rasul Kareem. I hope, inshallah, that what we say today will be of some use to at least some of you, inshallah. Very glad to be part of this webinar with Sister Tahara Akmal, who's a very accomplished chaplain, and Dr. Jimmy Jones, our founder and the backbone of the Islamic Seminary of America. I just wanted to share very briefly, if I may, see if I can, a small slide. Let's see, where do I go for the screen sharing? I guess it's here, share screen. Okay, and PPT. All right, so yes. So the subject of this discussion is leadership in the time of crisis. And I thought I'd just throw out a few ideas so that when we go into the discussion, we have this in the back of our mind. First of all, we need to have a sense of what is a time of crisis.
I think we may have lost the connection. You think so, IT? You think we lost the connection? So why don't we go to Chaplain Tahara and while Dr. Unus logs back on.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Dr. Jones.
Yeah, we lost him. So why don't we
okay.
while he's logging back on?
Oh, he's logging back?
Yeah, I assume so, but why don't you go ahead because we should go forward.
Okay. I'll get my PowerPoint. Okay. Well, first, I'd like to just thank you, Dr. Jones and Dr. Unus, for the opportunity to join in this conversation that I think is, very important to talk about leadership during this time of crisis for our nation and actually across the world. What I wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about the role of a healthcare chaplain and the leadership role that we take on and what that looks like in the care of others. I think that there's, my understanding, there's just so many different definitions of leadership, different ways that people think leadership should or should not look like. And just as we have different definitions and perspectives of leadership, we also have different perspectives in leadership on how we respond when people are in need. So I just wanted to share this first slide. As an educator of chaplains and a chaplain myself, this comes out of the Dictionary of Pastoral Care and Counseling. And I think it's really relevant for what we're experiencing today and just in general for healthcare chaplains. But the quote from the text says that the transition from health to illness is experienced by most persons as undesirable, stressful, and it's often traumatic, and it's a crisis. And any debilitation or illness that's involving suffering and pain, anxiety, fear, and so forth, can also lead to physical weakness, family and financial strains, feeling of lack of privacy, social isolation, and a deep sense of human vulnerability and frailty. And I just want to stop there for a minute to say that I recognize that our nation, our world, we're vulnerable right now because one common denominator for most of us is that we've never experienced this before. We've never been through a pandemic. We've never had to watch being close or far enough from people in order to stay safe or stay alive. So I could say that we are all in the same boat, so to speak, and that this is something that's very new. And perhaps a lot of us, if not most of us, have a sense of vulnerability and have throughout this crisis. Then the text goes on to say, and further, the patient or the person who's suffering the illness and their family may be faced with other issues such as guilt and forgiveness. We know about survivor's guilt. Let's say two people were at the same event. One person contracted COVID, one person didn't. Why didn't I get sick? You know, survivor's guilt. Diminished self-image. I know there has been, in some circles, stigma around those who have had COVID and survived. I've been with people who have gotten through the illness and they have felt some distancing from people, even loved ones and colleagues, because they've had the virus. And so some, you know, in some ways, some stigma. So diminished self-image, limited prospects, and questions and concerns about life, death, and theodicy, questions about God and so forth. And then the text ends by saying, none of these experiences is unique to the sick. All can be known in the best of health, but in illness, they are intensified. So a sensitivity and a sense of vulnerability for all of us that during this crisis right now of COVID-19, we are all possibly suffering and feeling vulnerable. And whether we're healthy at this point or have had the disease, it can affect us all in similar ways. So in the times of crisis, there's professional and ethical leadership that a chaplain has to maintain within the healthcare environment. And one thing about a hospital chaplain, you have to have a combination of your spiritual and theological identity, as well as what your role is in the institution. So as a Muslim, I come as a Muslim woman, I come with my understanding of Islam, and I also have a job description that I have to operate out of. So I'm constantly having to integrate the two. And so what I have found in my leadership is to just go back to Islam and find that foundation for myself. So from the hadith about how every human being has the sacred soul that Allah breathes into each person, that to me gives me that deep reverence and respect for everyone that I meet. As a hospital chaplain, I am not the chaplain for just the Muslims. I am the chaplain for everyone who walks into our institution. So that's patients and families and staff. Also from Islam, I draw upon the idea of human autonomy. Human autonomy, that Allah has blessed us with human choice. You know, we can make our own choices, and it comes directly from the Quran, where Allah says, let there be no compulsion regarding matters of faith. Allah has given us that freedom, and that parallels medical bioethics around patients' rights. Patients have the autonomy to refuse treatment, to have treatments, to make decisions and so forth, to have their religion respected, to have their religious needs met and so forth. So autonomy for us as Muslims and autonomy as a healthcare chaplain are congruent. And then the third one I listed on the slide is just understanding that human struggle, loss, grief, suffering is universal. And I've heard people say this, that COVID-19 does not discriminate. So also joining people in human suffering, human fear, struggle helps me to connect with people of all different backgrounds. And finally, as a healthcare chaplain, my foundational principles when I think about people in crises, I go back to Islam. I go back to the Hadith Qudsi, which has been foundational for me. And Dr. Jones mentioned that going through the process to become a certified educator through the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education is a rigorous process. And you are taught to integrate who you are theologically, who you are as a person, and your understanding of ministry all into this one service of ministry. And so I always go back to the Hadith Qudsi, where we're taught that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to a servant that I was sick and you did not visit me. And the servant says, oh Allah, how could I have visited you? You're Lord of the worlds. And Allah will say, did you not know that Brother Jimmy, he's a servant of mine, he was sick and yet you did not visit him? Should you have gone to see Brother Jimmy, you would have found me with him. That was significant for me and has always been foundational for me in my ministry, especially with people in crisis. I almost experience it as a direct invitation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be in the presence of the divine and be with people as they struggle. And then the final foundational principle that I've stood upon in my ministry is when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that for every step, as we're walking to visit someone who's struggling or sick, that we will be waiting in Allah's mercy. And that when we sit with the person, and that Allah will immerse us in the mercy until we return to our home. So I'm saying all of this to say, when people are in crisis, and as a chaplain, you're responding, what I draw upon are these Islamic principles to undergird my ministry. So when you think about people in crisis, there's two things I wanted to think about together. First, what our support looks like prior to any type of illness or crises, and what happens if you have a crisis, maybe perhaps COVID-19 or something, and you end up hospitalized. All right, so before that, you may have family, friends, significant other or partner, your imam, religious leaders clubs, your work colleagues, your worship community. You have all of this, all these different levels of support where maybe you feel loved, cared for. You can go places to get consultation and so forth. But changes in our spiritual and emotional support when we hit a crisis. I'm in the hospital, whether it's a scheduled surgery or scheduled procedure, or it's an emergent. Something has suddenly happened, and now I find myself needing care. My whole circle of support changes, and it's something we have to be mindful of people. Just like Dr. Unus said, to recognize these different dynamics when we're in crisis. Recognize that when people are sick or fearful or in the hospital and not knowing what's next, that their whole circle of support changes. And what's been really significant in these days with COVID-19, not only has this circle of support changed, in some hospital settings, our doors are just now starting to creep open. No, we were not allowing visitors due to the risk of the spread of COVID-19. So a lot of people were here, and their new circle of support became the chaplain, the physician, the social worker, the therapist, and so forth. So understand that sense of vulnerability and how people's world can change overnight is very significant when we're looking at people in crises. And as the chaplain, I put the chaplain in yellow, we assume that role as the leader and the expert in all spiritual matters. On the interdisciplinary team, the chaplain is the spiritual expert and leader for the institution and for the patients. When we're caring for those in crisis, these are just some of the things we want to think about. How do we address people's needs? First, the power of the ministry of presence. In the previous circles, what happens with the circle of support? People drop off. So the chaplain's role is to be present with people, to be kind, to be accommodating, to find out how we can serve them while they're away from their community. We also do a spiritual assessment. We're looking at who loves them, who's praying for them, how are they disconnected, what's meaningful to them, are they spiritual or religious? Maybe they're not. Maybe they find meaning in other things and it's not necessarily religion. So we make a spiritual assessment to figure out what's the best way to care for the person. Best ways we can, we try to connect them with their religious community or their family if possible. Very recently at our hospital, we're just letting some people in, but before that, our patients could only have a visitor if they were at end of life. So during COVID, unfortunately, a lot of people were dying alone, or they might have someone coming at the very last minute to try to be there. And also as chaplains, one of the ways we've had to manage crises is by making sure that we have some distance with COVID patients by providing care from a distance through iPads and so forth. So that has been a big change in loss of connection. Once we intervene, with whatever we feel is best, prayer rugs, Bibles, Qurans, whatever is helpful, we develop a plan of care for ongoing support for the patients that we see. And then if we're looking at community assessment during a crisis, I just want to shift really quickly because I don't want to go much longer. When we're doing a community assessment of people outside who are not necessarily hospitalized, again, we do some of the similar things, whether you're a chaplain or an imam or just someone concerned for your community. But understanding what their beliefs are, understanding how they understand the crisis from their faith or spiritual perspective. What are the rituals and practices that they find comforting for them? What are those practices that give them hope and feel like they have some sort of control in this crisis where we often feel that we have no control? What are the psychological dimensions? How is this crisis impacting their psychological well-being? How is it impacting family dynamics? We've heard a lot about how some families, unfortunately, during COVID, when they're forced into these closed, isolated situations within their home, there's been an increase in abuse, spousal abuse or child abuse. So those types of things, what are we recognizing? What are we seeing, if that should happen to be the case? Even when there's not abuse, what's it like for families now to be suddenly enmeshed, when we normally have, avenues for ourselves? What are the racial, ethnic, or cultural concerns? Right now in our country, there's huge concerns around racial dynamics, protests, people speaking up and out about injustices. So how is that, in addition to COVID or whatever else someone's going through, impacting someone's well-being? And how do people feel they have courage or hope or growth possibilities? For example, how do I feel that maybe going through this is going to help me in this area? Maybe if I survive this, I'm going to feel more confident in this area. What are the courage and growth possibilities out of a crisis? And how is the community coming together? Right? How is the community supporting one another? And when we look towards our leadership, who are the community spiritual leaders that we can depend on and go to? How are they equipped to provide the level of emotional, spiritual, and mental support that people may need? And maybe if our religious leaders are not equipped, how do we partner with others in our community, Muslims who are social workers or therapists or chaplains, to provide support for the community? And have the leaders, more importantly, taking care of their own needs? How is it your own self-care as a leader? The saying is, we can't give others what we're not giving ourselves. And I think that was my last slide. I want to stop there, Dr. Jones, because I don't want to go too long. But that's just kind of an overview of caring for people in the hospital who are in crisis, and just some thoughts about community. And I know we're going to have some conversation.
Very helpful. I would ask our viewers to send us your questions, and we'll try to respond to them at the end. Why don't you stop your screen share so
Okay.
Dr. Unus can turn his camera back on.
So Dr. Jimmy Jones, if you can have my video turned on.
Okay. IT, Ibrahim?
There we go. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, first of all, I really apologize, and it was my fault. But the only saving grace is that in times of COVID and heavy internet use and so on, this is happening even on national TV. So not an excuse, but putting it into context. So I just wanted to, this beautiful presentation by Sister Iqbal Tahara, and I just want to take a little broader approach to the question of leadership in times of crisis, and focus a little bit more on what may happen in the future, or how I may approach it in the future. So first of all, very quickly, when we talk about it kind of time of crisis, obviously it's a departure from the normal, and many times it's a turning point. So it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, but it's the turning point, changes from whatever it is we have that to what something that may be coming in the future. It's obviously an onset of distress. Norms are upended, which is basically the same thing as departure from the norms, and a radical change happens. Now, of course, currently we talk about COVID as a crisis, or the onset of COVID as a crisis. We talk about the consciousness of racial imbalance, racial injustice, and all those things. And the general environment, I mean, the general feeling among people for these reasons and many others, that this is really a time of crisis. And in times of crisis, a couple of things that are important is because the norms are no longer relevant, we need to have a flexibility in thinking on how we approach whatever is happening or whatever we need to do. And strategies that we may have laid out are no longer employable. And so we have to think in terms of contingencies. And again, established processes fail. And so we have to think in terms of innovation and creativity. And that is a basic requirement to be able to face and solve a crisis, or go over that hump of crisis. Now, let's talk a little bit about leadership. Of course, we know a lot about leadership, so I'm not going to talk at length about it, but a couple of things I want to emphasize, and that is especially significant in times of crisis. Because in crisis, power and authority is not leadership. Power and authority are static concept. Leadership is dynamic concept. So when we say somebody has leadership, that is not sufficient. Who exercises leadership, or how do we exercise leadership? So leadership is a dynamic concept that we need to keep, and we might talk about it more in discussion. And so it's a process, and it's a process of moving a group of people in a planned direction and motivating them to action through non-compulsive means. And this is very important, because in a crisis, there's a tendency to become authoritarian, to become, take over everything and get and have a compulsive kind of approach, or compulsion kind of approach. But that's not true leadership. If you want to exercise true leadership, it has to be a process that is non-compulsive. It has to be a process that is motivating. It has to be a process that moves people in a direction which is in their best interest. And it's a process of moving them, taking them along with you. And so the effective leader in that situation actually creates a vision of the future. And that's a very difficult thing to do, especially when you are in the middle of a crisis. You basically think everything is falling apart, and whatever we had thought about is not going to come to pass. And so one probably has to create a vision of the future that may be somewhat different. It has to be a vision that gives people hope, and there has to be rational strategy. There has to be support of key people, and so on. So these are elementary things to talk about. Now, I wanted to spend just a few minutes to talk about millennials, the generation of people, of young people or younger people who were born in roughly between 1980 and 2000. And why we want to talk about the millennials is because leadership is passing on to the millennials. And I'll also mention to you, and probably bring it up later on, that the book that Dr. Jimmy Jones mentioned is focusing on this concept of millennials being able to help us get beyond this crisis. Actually, the title of the book is How Can Millennials Lead Us Out of the Mess We Are In? And we look at the millennials as a generation that is going to take over and is going to provide the leadership that we hope for. And why? And it's also important because really, if we look at the generation before millennial and look at the millennial generation, we find very significant differences in approaches and ways of thinking, in ways of managing, in ways of leading. And they are an important group of people, as I said. In the next 10 to 15 years, you'll have the largest employee base will be millennials. The largest, fastest growing voting bloc is millennials. They generally have liberal views. They're generally idealists. They don't focus on zero-sum competition. They are more cooperative. The diversity that we talk so much about is second nature to them. They value differences, as opposed to the generation before them that is still struggling with diversity and sort of trying to focus on diversity as if it's something that they shouldn't have been the second nature to them, but it's second nature to the millennial population. And so they're more concerned about fairness, they're concerned about integrity, and so on. And so we really need to focus on their leadership, because their leadership is what is going to get us out of the mess we are in. For them, a leader is someone who mentors them. It's rooted in a process. Leadership is not a person. It's not one person and this person, that person, that person. It's the process, how you function, how that person functions, what does it do? And then it's inclusive of all employees or volunteers or the groups that you work with. It is inclusive. It is not a dictatorial leadership. It is not like a leadership that is not cooperative. It is more of a cooperative kind of leadership where ideas and involvement comes from different levels of the entity, the organization, the community, the nation, what have you. And so there is a shift in paradigm that's emerging where you have leadership from not only managers and supervisors and leaders and politicians and so on, but also from the grassroots. And the third part of this this topic of leadership in time of crisis is, where do you find leadership that you can look back to? Now, the argument that we're making in the book that Dr. Mijos mentioned is that to look at leadership, we need to go back to our roots and find ancient. To put it in a different way, you can say leadership comes from divine guidance. And divine guidance is transmitted to us through the stories of the messengers of God, how the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala solved problems, led people, and managed crises, and managed the environment they were in at their time. And some people might say, well, you know, that was old times, that was ancient stories. But when you really look at them, you find that those ancient stories are really timeless. That there is timeless lessons in those stories that apply to modern times. And we need to really look at them. And so we chose to look at the story of Musa alayhi salam as a story that has lessons that are still applicable to us, and especially applicable because the millennial model is very much in tune with the lessons that we learned from the story of Musa alayhi salam. Musa alayhi salam, of course, became a prophet from being a shepherd. And we know the whole story, so we're not going to go over the story of Musa alayhi salam. Everybody is well educated in that. But the point that we want to make is simply this, that there was this person who was a humble person. He had humility. He had both experiences of the opulence of a palace, and then the simplicity of being a shepherd. And then this person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose him, brings him to his presence, and then he gives him this assignment to go to Pharaoh and ask him to release his people. As you know, the Israelite population had become slave to the Egyptians, even though centuries earlier they were honored guests, and they lived for centuries as honored guests. But over time, the attitudes changed, and it became the question of these others who were coming from outside, and so they became slaves of pharaohs. But the thing that we really need to focus on, besides the details of the story, is the attitude of Musa alayhi salam when he was asked to go to Pharaoh and challenge him. What did Musa alayhi salam do? The first thing he did, he took an inventory of his strengths and weaknesses. And that is very important for leadership in a time of crisis, especially, that we exercise a humility in which we ask ourselves, what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses? And everybody knows this story, the famous thing when Musa alayhi salam says, that he thought his weakness was the ability to speak well. Now, this is a totally different, irrelevant question whether he could actually speak well or not. But he thought this was a weakness. And so he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the knot from his tongue, and so that people can understand him. And he asked, so that people can understand me. He didn't say so that I can speak better. He said so that people can understand me. And this is very important for leadership in a time of crisis. It is not about ourselves. It is about the others. It's about communicating them a message. It is not about the ability to speak well. It's about the ability to be understood. So this is a very important part of leadership. And the other part that came from this was that he immediately sought to asked for Harun al-Islam to be his partner, not only because he said Harun al-Islam can speak better than me, which is very important, that when we select our team, we are not we are not intimidated, or we don't have an overblown sense of our own ability, but we're able to bring people who are even better than us, because only then we can have a good team. So he brought him into his team because he thought he was better in his speech, regardless of whether he actually was or not. That's not a question. Now, I'm going to skip many of these things, but the idea here at that time was that marginalized people, who were the Israelites, were being oppressed, and there was an opportunity to speak truth to power, which had been presented. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has presented that opportunity to Musa alayhi salam to go and speak truth to power, and had assured him of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's own assistance. So there was marginalized people were being oppressed. There was an opportunity to speak to truth to power, and there was an assistance beyond one's own power that was evident. That was the power of, that is the assistance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised. And so leaders of the generation that is coming, that is going to take over leadership, and that we believe will be the leaders that will take us out of the crisis mode and the mess that we are in. We don't know how long it lasts. Are people who are strong, will have humility as well as personal will. Musa alayhi salam was a humble person. His training was as a shepherd, but when he was given a charge, he showed a strong personal will. And he was balanced leaders who are focused on doing well and doing good. And they were the providers of others. Their service, when Musa alayhi salam took the Bani Israel, once they relieved him, all his life, if you look at each incident in the time of when they were in the wilderness, it's all about caring for his flock, caring for the people that he was, and from that you can take it to the idea of servant leadership, which is a very significant concept that obviously we can't talk about right now. But the whole idea in servant leadership is the pyramid is inverted, that a leader exists to serve people. People don't exist to serve leader. That's the philosophy of servant leadership. Let me skip that. So I'll stop there. But the point I was trying to make here is that in a time of crisis, we have to think about, first of all, what's the nature of crisis is. Second, you have to think about what kind of leadership is needed to get over the hump. And third thing we think about, are there lessons that we can learn from divine guidance, which has been transmitted to us through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's messengers, and looking into ancient and timeless wisdom for guidance in times of crisis in the present day. Thank you very much. I hope it's been useful, inshallah. You have to mute yourself, Dr. Jimmy Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Unus and Chaplain Tahara. I've learned quite a bit from listening to the both of you, and I hope our viewers have. I'm going to encourage our viewers to ask us questions and send them in, and we'll try to take them at the very end of the show. I want to have a little conversation with both of our guests before we do so. And the first question I want to direct to Chaplain Tahara. In your work as a first responder dealing with the kind of crisis that we're dealing with in this country right now, and you've mentioned this in your presentation a bit, but I want you to expand a little bit. What aspects of the Quran and Sunnah are most useful to you?
Yes, I have lots of those verses from the Quran that are helpful. Let me actually, I have a little bit of a list here. Because in my role as a chaplain, and I mentioned this earlier, when you're a hospital chaplain, you're there to care for everyone who's there, unless you've been hired to be the Catholic chaplain or the Muslim chaplain or Jewish chaplain. So I see everyone. So there's so many verses from the Quran. The main one, I think, that is so big for me as an interfaith chaplain, or there are a couple. One that says, say, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Say, call upon God or call upon the Beneficent by whichever name you call on God. God has the most beautiful names. And the other verse from the Quran that says the most beautiful names belong to God, so call on God by them. those two are significant for me because when I first started exploring chaplaincy, I got some pushback. I got pushback from, Muslims in the community. Will you be asking questions like, will you be compromising your faith? How will you sit with people who call on Allah by a different name? How do you bring Islam into this, Christian context? So those two were very foundational for me because it gave me the understanding from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that people have the autonomy to be who they are and express their spirituality and religion by ever which way they choose. My role is not to change that. My role is to be present, to find out what people believe in and what gives them comfort and meaning during a crisis in their life or illness or death, if they're nearing death, and support them through that process of preparing to die, of thinking about what's next, making decisions about treatment and so forth. So those are two that were very foundational in my identity as a Muslim chaplain that sees everyone. Another verse from the Quran was very helpful for me to see everyone as part of my, under my care is from the Quran, this community of yours is a single community. So I'm not there just to select certain people to care for, but that everyone here is part of Allah's community. A couple of others, I really love this. It's words from the Quran where Allah says, and of God's signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge. And following that, another, it is God who has made for you the earth as a resting place and the sky as a canopy and has given you shape and made your shapes beautiful and has provided for you sustenance. So those verses help me again to show up in this environment where I've never had a Muslim CPE student, I'll say. All of my students that I've taught in the clinical pastoral arena have been non-Muslims. So for me to show up and to train people to be kind and loving to all people, these are other foundational verses from the Quran that Allah has created us all so different in our languages, in our belief systems, in our colors, the shapes of our bodies, that to me speaks to the universal spirit of humanity and the diversity and the beauty in the diversity that Allah has created, but this universal humanity that I'm called to care for. And other verses that point back to the various prophets that we find in the Bible and the Quran as being the same. And I'll stop there because I have many, many others.
Yeah. So folks who are watching, we're listening to two pioneers in this sense that Chaplain Tahara is a pioneer in emerging chaplaincy work in the United States. I mean, 50 years ago, we didn't think about this, and more women are stepping into a leadership role as a result of it. And we have Dr. Unus, who, when he started his work with the MSA, there were no models really for them. There was no model for Islam, and so I think we're blessed to have two pioneers who had to step in a time of crisis and create something. So Dr. Unus, the same question, and I happen to know that you consulted to not only help start it, but you consulted to Masjid I was affiliated with. I had two consultants in times of crisis. What do you draw from the most when you run into a situation that's full of crises?
Yeah, briefly, the way I look at the Quran, and of course Sunnah also, but the Quran mainly, is as a book for guidance. Mm-hmm. And therefore I'm looking for a specific guidance from the Quran. And the way I look at it is that I get the most guidance from the stories and narrations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's messengers, God's messengers in the Quran. You're talking about Ibrahim alayhi salam, you're talking about Musa, you're talking about Yusuf alayhi salam, all these stories that are beautifully narrated in the Quran. And they are narrated not just for the sake of stories, they're narrated for the sake of giving us guidance. And we need to really look at them and read them and harvest them, so to say, for guidance. And we can talk about it at some other time, about each of them, each of the stories, even Zulqarnain's story, there is some guidance for leadership in that. And there's guidance in leadership in Ibrahim. And the reason we are attracted or our team is directed to Musa alayhi salam is because Musa alayhi salam's story is the most detailed story in the Quran, most referred to story in the Quran. But in addition to that, it's also a story that is most common between the Christians and the Jews and Muslims. And the book that we have been referred to is a book that is co-authored by a Jew, a Christian, and myself. And we have focused on this idea that there is so much commonality in the story of Musa alayhi salam, and so many lessons that each of these three faiths agree and accept on. And this is important in today's world, because we are not going to solve our crisis, or we are not going to get out of this mess just as Muslims. We have to think of it in terms of a society that we are part of. Now, if you want to take a leadership role in it, if you want to take a more constructive role in it, if you want to be beneficial to everybody, that's all we have to do. But we can't isolate ourselves and say, okay, we will solve our crisis as Muslims and let everybody else worry about what they are. This will not happen, because we're integrated in a multicultural society, and especially with the major Abrahamic religions. And therefore, it's important to look at these, to look at the Quran and look at it in a way in which it also benefits us in interacting with peoples of other faith. And therefore, the Muslim story. So the way to summarize the thing, the way I look at the Quran is a book of guidance, and I look for guidance through stories of the messengers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I find the story of Musa alayhi salam the most comprehensive and the most attractive story.
The hour's gone so fast, and I think in hindsight, we should have had you on separate, because they're related, absolutely, but there was so much we could learn from both of you being pioneers in your field. So one more question before we wrap up. What are the common mistakes for you, Chaplain Tahara, particularly, you train people, right, Chaplain? And I'm sure you know other Muslim chaplains just as professionally, even though you don't train them in Muslims. From your perspective, in dealing with crisis, I mean, and you've been around Muslim organizations, what do you think the most common mistake we tend to make as Muslims in times of crisis?
I would say that, and I think Dr. Unus touched on this a little bit, that we can all step up and be leaders in different ways, and that times of crisis, for who's ever in charge or whoever is looked at as the leader, to look for others out of the community who can also take a role in support and help. For example, there was and Dr. Jones, you were there. We talked last year, or I think it was at the conference at Yale, and there was a mapping project done, and they looked at Muslim chaplains across the country. And one of the conversations I thought was really interesting, and it was about how could possibly, if this is an idea, what would it be like if imams and chaplains collaborated? You know, so where areas where the imam has strength in this area, or the chaplain might have strengths in psychology or something, you know, how do we collaborate? And I thought that was such a wonderful idea. But how do we collaborate with other Muslims in the community who have skill sets, expertise, knowledge, and come together and during times of crisis and get everyone involved, and not put the burden on our imams, our scholars, not just, you know, we do need them for their knowledge, but there's also people in the community who can serve and help in so many different ways. And I think sometimes we forget that.
That's an excellent point, because if you look at the way we deploy our faculty, we often have team teachers, right? We have individuals sometimes, we often have team teachers, because we try to model what we think should happen in the field. That is to say, like Musa alayhi salam, you know, inventorying his strengths and say, maybe I need someone else to come along with. Dr. Unus, what's the most common mistakes you see people in leadership or organizations make in times of crisis?
Yeah, I think one mistake would be to think of a time of crisis as not an opportunity for improving, changing to something better. Because if you're looking at time of crisis simply as, well, how can you get past this somehow? Well, then we'll not be doing anything useful. Right. But if you look at it as a crisis where, okay, things have to be done differently now. But what can that differently mean? What can it be differently? So that's one thing, to look at time of crisis as also, in a sense, a time of opportunity to turn the page, so to say. And the other thing is, again, it comes back to leadership style, that in time of crisis, more than any other time, you need people to come together, and you need to exercise a kind of leadership which is more of a involving people and more of encouraging, more of, again, the servant leadership type of situation, because the tendency will be, okay, it's a crisis, let's just give orders and be authoritarian. That's just the wrong way of doing it, because then it may get you past the crisis, but really no, it just means you're waiting for the next crisis. But if they take the opportunity of the crisis to exercise a servant leadership, where we say we're going to serve people, we're going to help them get over this, then when you're on the other side of crisis, they are with you and the bonds are stronger and the opportunities, turn into results.
So the way we're going to wrap up is we're going to ask Chaplain Tahara to any parting words of advice to people who are either first responders or leaders in organizations in crisis. The same for Dr. Unus, and then we're going to ask Chaplain Tahara to close with the closing dua after that. But I just want to say that much of what you hear here is a theme within the institution itself. Our recent MOU with the United Theological Seminary touches on some of those same themes, that we ought to come together and do something about developing leadership, and in this case with the Christian Seminary. And so just a little commercial, those of you looking for an accredited degree, because we can't be accredited because we're so young, we do have a joint Master of Divinity and Interreligious Chaplaincy that you might consider. Okay, so Chaplain Tahara, what parting advice would you leave for folks who either think about chaplaincy or maybe leadership?
Yes, I would say do some research. There are, as Dr. Jones talked about, we have the Islamic Seminary of America. We're developing, I'm new to the board there, but I'm excited about what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing with the Islamic Seminary of America. And I would say that for those of you who love education, once you decide chaplaincy is for you and you go through the process to become to get your seminary degree, become board certified, and to even think about becoming an educator in the clinical environment. I think there's about 4 or 5 of us across the nation who are Muslim, who are certified to teach chaplaincy in a clinical environment. So, if that's what you feel you're being called or led to as your career, I would encourage you, and I'd be available for some consultation and feedback and support.
Dr. Unus?
Yeah, if I understand your question correctly, I think I wanted to probably say something in extension to what Tahara said, is that the seminary, the idea of a seminary is to train people for leadership. It's not simply knowledge. There's a knowledge base, of course, we need a knowledge base, but the knowledge base has to be then put to use in terms of exercising leadership. And the important thing that I think we need to emphasize about the seminary and the whole idea of a seminary is that it serves a whole range of things. It's not simply chaplaincy in the hospital or chaplaincy in this and chaplaincy that, but a leadership of the community as a whole. So you can talk about imams, you can talk about nonprofit management leaders, you can talk about counselors, educators, and all these people who need to have skills based on knowledge and rooted in the Quranic paradigm and the Sunnitic leadership. So basically, the idea being that the seminary is a wider ground for learning and training and exercising leadership, and that leadership can be then utilized in a number of fields. And there are career opportunities that are opening up for graduates of seminaries.
MashaAllah, spoken like true board members of the Islamic Seminary. I'd like to thank everybody for watching. Again, if you want to learn more about us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, go to our website. As has been indicated, we don't only give degrees, but we try to do training, we do try to do consultation. So reach out to us. And now we ask Chaplain Tahara to close out this session with the dua.
Yes, thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. O Allah, the all-knowing, all-hearing one who hears our prayers and comforts our hearts in times of uncertainty and crises. Allah, you are our source of light and hope as we continue to live through the COVID-19 pandemic and as we speak out and against historical systemic injustices in our nation. We are grateful for your love that envelops us during these difficult times. Allah, we are thankful and humbled by the opportunities you have placed before us to affect change in our communities through service and education. As we work to establish TISA as an institution that develops and inspires our future leaders, we ask that you bless our intentions and give us wisdom in our decision-making. Grant us to endure all things with patience and with confidence, knowing, as you remind us in the Quran, that all matters in life return and end with you. As we continue to care for ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities during the pandemic, Allah, we ask that you keep us safe and healthy. Protect us and all of humanity under your shade of mercy and compassion. Ameen.
Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Take care.